So welcome everyone. Here we are on a new episode of Rise and Play, and I'm sitting here in Helsinki at the studio of Lightheart Entertainment with Kalle, Kaivola, that also I've known like for 4 years, as far as I can remember, even maybe before, but at least more officially 4 years. And in this series, I am continuing as well to interview co-founders of startups and also with an interesting approach, different approach on company culture. And here we are reflecting 4 years after the foundation of a company 4 years ago when we discussed, and also interesting time to reflect as well on the specific company culture that you've implemented since the early days. But before we start, a few key points also to introduce to our guest. Who are you, Kalle? So you have 25 years in the industry, like in media, entertainment, games, a bit all around, like also founding also other ventures, I think, as well in the past. Yes. And today you are one of the founders of Lightheart Entertainment. Started 4 years ago in Helsinki here, where I am, for a time of PGC Helsinki as well. And your studio has been known for the hit, I can say a hit, because it's really hard these days releasing new games that are growing and also make a company live. Mr. Autofire, which has counted to date 16 million of download. And the genre of the game is platformer shooter. I have played it as well, very cute with that Mr. Autofire we see here. And that's the game, the main game you have had so far with, of course, development of new games. And what we are here today to talk about, company culture, and really caught my attention at the time. You were creating the company not to make good games only, but also finding better ways to make games. And where we have found common discussion was at the time we have had interest in the same book, Reinventing Organization from Frédéric Laloux, that I recommend, just to reflect some thoughts of how can you build a company culture. And you wanted to build a studio that doesn't have a traditional hierarchy, and something different, which we will cover today. So with no further ado, welcome Kalle to your own office, but welcome on the podcast. So pleased to have you today.
Great to have you on the podcast over here. And I think it's funny, we spoke 4 years ago. It feels like a lifetime ago because we had just set up the company. We had COVID was yet to happen, like all the madness that has happened in the mobile industry was still to happen. But yeah, we started the studio after Frédéric Laloux's book had already come out. We as founders read it and had these notions of, hey, if we're going to start a new company in Helsinki in 2019, we should have some kind of a better idea than to just make new games, because there's a lot of studios in town. So that was one of the driving forces, and that's when one of our founders was like, so what if we don't have managers? And I was like, I got to tell you, like my immediate knee jerk was like, what, we don't have managers? Like, that's my entire self-worth as a, like my whole marketability as a professional is built on my managerial and director level experience. Are you crazy? You're going to ruin this for me. And then fortunately I shut up at the moment. I was like, why do I have such a strong feeling about it? Why does this invoke so much dread in me, the idea that there are no managers? What are these fears? Like, I better get to the bottom of these before I say something really stupid. And I explored that thought, and it took me on personally on a journey of like kind of figuring out like that, in fact, any sort of managerial position I'd ever held, I'd always taken kind of the role to be that like I want to enable the people who are in my team or in the group that I'm in to succeed, enable them to do better. And often I would actually create a very non-hierarchical bubble within a very hierarchical organization. Which is problematic sometimes because you have to interface with the rest of the company and so on. But this was like, I realized once I got the shock out of the system, like this would be an opportunity to try to do that for real, like for mandated. So I'm supposed to do that. That felt like a good challenge. That felt something new, terrifying, but in kind of good, terrifying way.
I like traveling back 4 years ago when we've had that conversation and in the context that it was. And I want to reflect on a few things that you just shared. Like you have had a lot of experience in gaming, and I think again, like you felt in your heart that there was maybe another way to build teams that was true to you. And what I appreciate is like when you were really in the position to create something new, you could have decided to follow what's proven. There are so many new things to explore already on the market, but also here taking the risk, but at the same time going for something that is true to you, another way of working that you believed in. And also, I think like deconstructing even, like I would say, which I found difficult, not only in games, but when we look at position of power, leadership, founders, the ego. Because what you're talking about is like, who am I if I'm not a manager and I don't have the title and the power? And you said, okay, I need to figure this out inside before I even start a company. Do you remember some of that process that was introspection for you? To be okay with that thought, like with the fears that you had before starting a company like this, where you're letting go of control.
Yes. Yeah, we actually have a magnet on the fridge of the company that says "Relax, nothing is under control," which I feel is sort of exemplifies the kind of thinking there. Like, because it also implies that weirdly everything is under control. But I think it's a longer route to get there. We'll be talking about it. But I think ego is exactly right. I think that's what you need to look at, because I noticed myself going through kind of that mental process that what if what I say doesn't automatically go? Like, what if I'm not the boss of the company, and I'm like, because I'm like, for the context of this, I'm the CEO of the company, but it looks very different from a traditional role. Like, I don't go around managing people. It looks very different. But at the end of the day, so what I started thinking about was like looking at all the sort of the strongest leaders I work with, and then the sort of the least efficient leaders. And the more you kind of relied on the fact that what I say goes, the less effective you were typically as a leader. It's just, you start seeing enough of that pattern emerge, and you realize that I'm like, it doesn't matter whether I'm in sort of indirect charge of these things. In order for me to be efficient as a leader, I still need to make the case for these things. I still need to operate with things like setting goals in an understandable fashion, and kind of forming the idea of getting somewhere. And that's never going to be a thing where if I just come here and I'm yelling to do this or that thing, that's not very impactful in terms of getting anywhere. I mean, not to even mention that a game company typically has a lot of passionate experts who are really good at what they do. And if somebody tries to micromanagement, they immediately become the bottleneck of the whole organization. Yeah. And the organization cannot rise above the deficits of that individual. And I have many deficits. I don't want to be that guy. I'm very cognizant of sort of limits of my abilities there. So I'd much rather approach it from this angle. It has been a lot better for me now that I can do it openly, and I don't have to sort of fear an external party looking into, what are you doing? You don't have, well, this guy isn't reporting to you. I don't have to worry about what an outside organization thinks about us.
Yeah, and that's great. That's also, I think, when you are creating your own company, the thing you can do the most for yourself is one that really looks like what you and what you believe in, like when you really look inwards and not what you think is expected of you. As when we have more roles in like an organization, we fit a role, and what is expected of us, it's not always what we want to do. But here you have a full opportunity to actually try something that looks like you as a group of co-founders, your theory and your beliefs.
Exactly, and I think what we are trying to do is like, how do we, like, our challenge is how do we scale this as a group of founders. I think initially I was speaking with one of my co-founders, Mika Ahonen, the other day, and like we were talking about our kind of early days, and I think like he had a good point that when you think about the best teams and that you've been in, what do they have in common? Very often they weirdly have this kind of, they have similar things in them. Like when you think about like, when was the last time you were making games and you were really excited in the morning to get up and do your thing and be part of the team? Typically those teams actually aren't like these hierarchically run things where there's a director. Like everybody kind of knows what to do, they know their roles, and they've kind of very sort of in a very fine-tuned fashion defined their roles within the team, not in a sort of, here's the list of our job titles and corresponding responsibilities, and here's our Roski charts determining our responsibilities, etc. Like, those don't typically bring the kind of, when you get to this very super efficient kind of phase of interfacing with each other, it requires a lot more fine-tuned conversations, and they're best kind of left to the individuals to do amongst themselves. These teams tend to have a self-organizing element to them. And that's what we want to encourage. And to us, it's kind of a tightrope act sometimes of these the teams we have should also look a little different from each other, because no two groups of individuals form in exactly the same kind of ways, because people are different. And we have a lot of very multidisciplined, multi-skilled experts. They, by nature, form around problems in a different way. So we're kind of figuring out what are the best sort of boundaries and constraints that a team could have, or what are the best practices that we could offer available to the teams too when they're developing these ways of forming together.
All right, and as we already got into the topic, let's get indeed in the details, but for context as well of our listeners, what are we talking about, like the reference of a culture that you had in mind when you started? So back to the book Reinventing Organization, there's a hierarchy of different organizations with the color coding, like you have orange, green, and then teal. And teal is like the one, if I have a way to describe, like purpose-driven organization, self-organized, as you said the word, and we'll get into detail about that. And as a start of inspiration for a foundation of your company, I'm curious about how, because I think you were several co-founders when you started, 4 or 5?
So we had 5 working
Yes.
co-founders in the beginning.
So this is already, I remember when I read the book, it's a provocative, like I felt like it's provocative idea and theory, and I love it. And I was like, how does that work in practice? And so I imagine whoever came up with the thought, one or several people, how do you align 5 people to even start a company based on that? How did that conversation go at the start? To let's try this as a group.
Well, me sort of being the person who would have traditionally been at the top of hierarchy, I felt like I had to go through some amount of pain to kind of get behind it. And I think like very quickly, like once I got over the hump of understanding that this actually mirrors what I've inherently tried to do anyway, sort of organically, it was a little easier. But I think when you start a new company, they tend to have a teal element to them. If you have 5 people in a room working together, it's quite natural for sort of roles and responsibilities to form organically. You build trust, like you typically have a lot of very active transparency, not just like we have all the information in a file in a Dropbox folder somewhere. No, it's like very active that people tell each other what they need as context for what they do, and they're very active in doing that. For us, it was really important to kind of take this seriously and not treat this as kind of a shortcut to, oh, we don't have any rules at all. We don't have any hierarchy, so we don't have anything. Like to keep like actively making sure that things are happening, like decisions are being made. And I think this is very crucial for us. Like when we kind of wrapped our heads around the fact that we are doing this so we can make better decisions, because we're able to involve the experts organically in all decisions and not route them to a random person not random, but like somebody very distant in the hierarchy who may or may not have the relevant insight into the problem at hand, but they're the one making the decision because that's their pay grade, that's their job title, that's what they have to do. I think that's the power of this kind of organization. And once we kind of understood that's the benefit from this, we were able to focus on our decision making. And I think that was one of the, if you take one thing away from that book, Reinventing Organizations, and want to work on a sort of a teal company or your version of whatever teal is. I don't like labels. I don't think we're a teal company, but we're very much a teal inspired company. So if there's one thing to take away from that, would be the advice process. And just shortly, because this is not familiar to everybody, and I've heard different phrasings for this, but essentially I'm going to make a very condensed version of it. Is if you want to make a decision, anybody in the company can make any decision, as long as, number one, they talk to everybody who knows more about the topic than they do. Notice talk, not ask for permission, talk to everybody. Secondly, they talk to everybody who's affected by the decision. And then they make the decision. That was it. That's the process. Of course, if the decision is something more meaningful than where are we going for lunch, you probably want to document it as well. So I feel this is kind of a little nerdy, techie way of looking at it. I feel this is, for the programming people out there, I feel this is like a base class of decision making, and then you can have subclasses that incorporate these elements but might have more features added on top of that. I think a very good example of that is we very soon realized that hiring needs to be, we can do it with this process, but it has to have for the hiring process to be effective and transparent and and work well for both the company and the applicant. It's important that it's very repeatable and it has the same elements, and you're making decisions informed about that everybody knows who we're talking about and so on. So that process is based on this, but it's a lot more convoluted. Like, well, not but it's more. It has a lot more steps, but in the end, it has the same elements. But that's what we really focused on, is how the advice process sort of works. And at this point, I'm sure that somebody listening to this, they're gonna go, "What? Anybody can make any decision? What if somebody orders a nuclear submarine or whatever?" And fair point. What if somebody does order a nuclear submarine? But I kind of want to talk about another learning I had, and something that us as founders found out very soon was that nobody goes around ordering nuclear submarines. People tend to make good decisions. People tend to want to make good decisions. They want to make informed decisions, and they want to make fair decisions, especially if you screen in recruitment for people who want to have a more holistic take on their work, like make decisions more broadly than just their sort of specialist niche that they're also doing. So I think a lot of the processes that we see in, whether it's like in companies or maybe even if you look at legislation at large, they tend to be, I feel, formed out of fear of abuse. So a lot of the things that we do are built so that what if somebody does this? What if somebody does that? And I feel the end result of that is such a giant baggage of collective debt that it's kind of it stifles what we can do, because just on the off chance you do something awful, something terrible, like that's just rarely the case. But to the person asking the submarine question, such a straw man, I came up with it myself. But let's say you think about, still, what if somebody does order the submarine? We do have a conflict resolution process. Like if somebody decides something clearly, like abuses the system, like that's the serious offense. If you abuse the system, you listen to everybody, but you totally clearly disregard what they're doing, then we can activate like conflict resolution process where we take, wait, hold your horses, let's look at this. Is this really a good idea? And we've had to use that 0 times so far, which is surprising to me. Like when we started, I had this kind of weird running clock in my mind, like how many days or weeks or months before essentially some kind of veto situation needs to happen, meaning this conflict resolution process hasn't happened yet. 4 years and running. I don't mean that I feel that we probably slightly lucked out that it hasn't happened per se, but it could have happened, but I think people over analyze the edge cases when they think of rules, because I think like a lot of corporate life is like the end result of that baggage of process that I was talking about. It does kind of drown out a bit of your identity, and you're kind of left looking at loopholes a little bit. Yeah. It becomes a little bit of a meta game of its own, and I don't think it happens naturally. It can happen in any company, and certainly we're not going to be immune to it as we grow. We're around 30 people right now, and we've grown to it over 4 years organically, and not had a lot of turnover, like employee turnover. So it's been easier to grow the culture because it's pretty much the same people around and so on. So it becomes, but the causality here is also important to look at it. I feel that the fact that people have the ability to affect change where they want it, I think that also makes people a little more interested in engaged in the company in a way, like because they have the ability to do more, and they're less sort of driven by the political winds of whatever is happening there. And of course, we're at 30 people. The question for us is, can we do this at 300 people? I don't know, but I'm optimistic. I want to try. I feel it's a meaningful thing. It's a good goal for us. It's a good thing to see if we can get there. But so far, I've been surprised at how awesome people are in general, and how easily we forget that, weirdly.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing all of it as well reflection point of 4 years later between the theory and the practice. And I think what I take away from a few things you shared, when you open the valves, you're kind of surprised of what things don't go wrong sometimes as well. And by legacy, a lot of processes, a lot of compliances are more indeed to avoid the case that can destroy everything. But in reality, does that happen so often? And it depends on for which reason it happens. But in the case, it did not happen, and you didn't have to use your veto. So I took also note of quite few specific things that are uncommon, I would say, in a studio, even company structure. like no hierarchy, that decision-making process, which I think it's a very simple framework explained this way, who has knowledge and who is affected by the decision. So it puts more responsibility on the individual to think with themselves, or maybe ask advice of someone else to think on the even decision-making process, probably. And conflict resolution part, which is also kind of self-organized. I'd like to go more in the detail of, in practice, how did you create that result? Because what I'm thinking, I have also built a studio, and then when you have a philosophy on how to make a team, for me, I have found it helpful to even write it for myself, for whoever comes in, to even verbalize my own thoughts, or how are we working here? How did you convey those principles for people joining, or did they receive it from others by communication? Like, well, what are...
Yeah, I don't know. I get it. Yeah, no, that's a really good question, because that certainly didn't like magically happen. It's easy to look at this and kind of look at, well, it's some kind of weird anarchy thing that's just like evolving on its own. It's certainly not. There's a lot of conscious effort being put into it, as you noted there. So that has a lot of different aspects to it. I think like one of them is we put a lot of work into hiring. And this was weird. When we were starting the company, this would have been over 4 years ago, I was sitting down with an older friend of mine, Jouni Utriainen, who was one of the first post-founder employees at Supercell. And we're just chatting, like catching up, and ended up spending, I think, a nice solid 3-hour lunch talking about like things. He was reminiscing the old days, and he was saying like that, you know what, like it felt at times we were putting so much effort into recruitment that it started feeling like just as a burden, like it felt really inconvenient. And in the end, I'm so happy that we did that. And that kind of weirdly, that stuck with me, like through that was a thing I really took away from that. And I had this notion of myself, and we talked about this with the founders, others had slightly similar takes, that we had all done a lot of hiring as founders. Most of us had a managerial background, being sort of heading, whether it's tech or art or product or whatever teams. And as when you're in a big organization, you tend to do a bunch of hiring and be involved in that. I think that leads to this weird fallacy of your competence, so that if you ask people on the street, stop them, ask them, are you an above average driver? 90% are going to say that yes. And statistically, of course, that's not going to work. I feel hiring is the same thing in companies. Like people are like, yeah, I'm pretty good at it. And then I started like thinking, like, what if I look at it a little bit more sort of openly and honestly. And I realized I'm not sure I'm very good at it at all. Like we took it very seriously, that we kind of learned hiring in general, and then specifically figured out like how do we apply what we're trying to do to this, because it's really important that we find people who want to join us. It's important they want to make kind of games we do, that's true, but they should also, an optimal hire for is somebody who wants to make them this way, for whom trying this kind of way of working is something they've really kind of either openly or maybe even secretly from themselves wanted to do for a while. And we started finding sort of questions on how do we bring that up in the interviews, and started developing kind of a method for that. But I think this is the sort of not very sexy, unpopular kind of part of it. We as founders put a lot of time into it. Like I was doing so many calls with so many people. Fortunately, I like talking to people and meeting new people, so it was kind of great. But like during COVID, when you had like this, remember that kind of Zoom fatigue, that you were already so tired after a day, and then you were just constantly meeting new people. It was pretty exhausting. But I think again, it was very valuable for us. I think it got us to a good place, in that we were able to find the right people for us, and started learning like ways of finding people telling about exactly the good and the bad associated with this, so that people who don't like this were able to kind of go, whoa, okay, I didn't realize that would involve all that, so maybe not. And I think it's important, because you alluded to this earlier as well, like there's surely downsides to this as well. Like the advice process, it does put a lot of pressure on an individual to kind of be part of the meaningful decision making of the company, whether it's through making a lot of decisions yourself, or enabling others to make decisions, or taking part in the sort of advice process from the sidelines. And that's not trivial, because though the advice process it's pretty robust in the sense that it produces good results, but it can fall victim to a lot of sort of bad faith practices. There are people who are like just this, if you think about phenomenon in any kind of human conversation like social media, you think about like sea lioning, where people like incessantly ask irrelevant questions and kind of drain everybody of energy. If you do that to the advice process, it does start to crumble. People start to avoid making decisions. So there needs to be a bit of sort of, I don't want to call it tone policing, because I think tone is not doing justice to the gravity of how important this is, but kind of shielding the process so that it remains a good faith process, like that don't subvert it to your own goals, because you can destroy any kind of conversation. There's always that guy at the party who comes and, yeah, we're not going to be able to have a conversation now because somebody's doing something bad faith. So there is that, and I think Lalou talks about this sort of, or at least in the teal sort of circles, this concept of kind of maintaining the space becomes important. So this previously leadership had these functions of make decisions and make goals and to strive forwards, etc., inspire people. This maintaining the space has never kind of been part of the vocabulary, and specifically what that means in our context is that we have individuals, and it's not just me, it's not even primarily me, it's a lot of people who value what we have, and they work in very diverse kinds of roles, who maintain the space for decision making, and they do things such as making sure that these sort of bad faith decision conversations don't evolve, but also kind of make sure that decisions end up getting made. And if a decision gets stuck, like, okay, somebody's not able to make the decision because it becomes too complicated for them, they help dissect it, because it doesn't mean that if you're somebody, say you're a junior person coming into the game team and you're like, there's a lot of veterans here, I don't have the confidence to say that I think the version control system we're using is bonkers, we should use something more modern because this is going to set us back. But I don't dare say that. There are people who facilitate these people talking to the right people, and maybe having somebody more experienced kind of take the decision maker's part role there. And these are the kind of things you do to maintain the space so that the decisions do actually end up getting made and are made in good faith and with taking the relevant data points into consideration. And some of the things like where we are at right now, 4 years in, some of this is happening organically, but we don't necessarily have a replicatable mold where we can just copy paste indefinitely like into teams. We learned 2 years ago when we started our second team, like after Mr. Autofire, we started working on Sword Game. We realized that, wow, this is one of those things that we knew we'd hit this bump in the road at some point. Whenever an organization splits into two things, where previously you could focus on one thing and everything you could always prioritize according to the one defining reason, in our case, Mr. Autofire, it was easy to make a lot of decisions, but everything gets a lot more complicated after that. So we kind of got over that hump now that we are better at, like, we have these roles and kind of responsibilities within the teams. They are more, we prefer these kind of best practices rather than strict guidelines that this is how to operate. But we're kind of past that, but what we're not yet is how would you roll this out to a giant organization? This is something we're constantly learning, and I think this is crucial from anybody kind of building an organization like this, to remember that you're going to be learning a lot. And going to circle back to the ego comment, ego can really get in the way of you learning. And I think that's one of the hurdles that all of us as founders have had to go through. It's so easy to kind of think that you might know the best practices of this or that thing. You need to constantly relearn them. That's just how it works. And I feel the game industry is quite suited for this kind of thinking, because like our industry is moving forward so fast that we have to relearn the market and things anyway. Yeah. So why not process this while we're doing it, and then kind of organizational philosophy as well.
Yeah, and that's why like what you're sharing today with game studio practices is kind of a new era of some studios trying different philosophies. Yes. And a few points to recognize, like how far can that kind of system scale. But it comes down, I think if I have to say, like practice for that kind of organic, self-organized culture to exist. Because as I understand, it kind of autocorrect by itself through the people. It's through the people in hiring where you have put a lot of attention at the beginning. So I think this is an essential point when we start to build a culture. It starts with the people that you're hiring, and growing. And I want to get to some details of like pure people, because those are interesting and also quite controversial. And I'm really curious how it has worked for you. So there's one which is no titles, right? I don't know if to this point, like when you had the vision, is it still true today where you don't have the titles, but somehow people understand what they are doing, what is expected of each other? Because from my experience, I have seen as well, hiring fast, sometimes that can lead to some complication where roles are overlapping.
Yeah.
And second question is like related, like how a studio grows is also how people grow, evolve. So there comes like things like perks, training, promotion, and also salary. And I understood as well, like salary are defined as well by the group or individuals. Yes. And I'm very curious how in practice that has worked for you. Has it been the same since the early days? How has it evolved? Like, what are your key learnings around that?
Yeah, there's a lot of things. We've certainly learned a lot from those. We start kind of with the roles and that. So we have that, like we have one person with a job title, and that's me. I'm the CEO of the company, but that's more sort of from an outside perspective. Yes. Investors want somebody to yell at if some things aren't happening, and kind of I feel that makes sense. Also, if you look at our people on LinkedIn, they have sort of outward facing roles for like titles for convenience. I don't know what they are because I don't really look at LinkedIn so much. Internally, everybody's a game developer. So that's the role that we have. And it's kind of part of, it deals with another sort of personal issue of mine, whereby when a company gets structured into these disciplines in a way, like it makes making decisions a lot harder. And it's harder to work as a team when you have to let's talk to the tech department or the marketing department or whatever. And it's very hard to build things together when you're constantly kind of routing for approval from various departments. So we kind of want to do away with that. Plus, there's a lot of roles that cross boundaries easily. If you look at what would be product management versus marketing versus like practical user acquisition and so on, like these things there's so much overlap here that it really helps that people are allowed to kind of extend to the range of their passions and skills and interests. So that builds a lot more kind of empathy into the really difficult decisions you face as a company, such as like when to start a game development, when to start a game project, when to kill a game project, like when to do like scoping, like what should we cut from the game and should we continue these things. If you do these in silos, I feel that everybody, like these decisions become like things that nobody wants to touch, and they get kind of bounced between departments, and that leads to like really poor decision making. And I think that this sort of thing, organizing yourself this way, is a lot better, and people can bring sort of their best skills forward. Now, I've also been in situations where there's overlapping responsibilities and mandates and so on, and that can cause a lot of confusion. I do think that actually titles play into that rather than help with that. Because if you have a traditional way to find a startup is like you get like people from 5 different companies who come with 5 preconceived notions of how hierarchy, like how titles and departments and things, roles and responsibilities work. So I feel that creates inherently a lot of confusion. When you kind of unmask that and allow people to go, I know about this and that thing, and now super importantly, we try to build an organization where you can also safely say, I don't know this thing and I don't know that thing. Like anybody coming into the organization, I always tell them that there's 2 things you should always be allowed to say in like when you're here. One of them is I don't know, and preferably followed with let's find out if it's possible, that but it should always be like you should always be allowed to say I don't know with no pressure on you, because once you start masking that leads to really bad places and bad outcomes. And then the second thing is why. Again, importantly, a good faith why, not the sort of why did you wear that today, sort of like that being goal oriented with the why, but rather we should always ask ourselves why. But I think this kind of thing, like once you build this trust through this very active transparency, it's a lot hard. Like you'll still find situations where it's, oh man, nobody's really making these decisions, but it's a lot easier for somebody to just raise their hand and say, nobody's making these decisions, let's find out how to do it. Like in a traditional organization, there's a lot of ego, a lot of sort of, well, I'm the producer, but I have no idea what they're talking about, but I'm being paid to know what they're talking about right now, so I should have an opinion. So then you get a lot of this you get a lot of sort of noise to your signal.
Yeah.
And I feel this way, and I think this is like for anybody looking to build a teal organization, I think the culture of everybody being very open about their strengths and limitations is key to building like the kind of structure that we have. And you really can't bypass that, because you can't be sort of, you can't spend your day kind of role playing a person that's a traditional corporate sort of LARPing situation where like, well, I'm a manager who knows everything, obviously. I wouldn't be having this salary if I didn't. Like, it becomes really bad. So like you gotta be pretty brave to do this. And this is one of those things, like when somebody's coming in, I'm very open about these things. Yes, I mean, some of this stuff sounds like, oh, that would be wonderful from a working context. It would be great to be able to say that. But I also try to let people go through the process of letting that sink in and realize that, oh, it is also mildly terrifying that I have to tell that, oh, wow, there is this or that. I remember in the first year of when we were founded, I was diagnosed with ADHD, which is probably about half the listeners have already caught on to that. But bringing that up as being like 43 years of age at the time, that was kind of, and just starting a company together, I was like, guys, do you still want to do this? Because I just found this out. I felt for me, that was like a really big moment in moving forward. Okay, I can be myself. Because of course I was on a journey of finding out like why some things were so hard for me and why some things were so easy for me. And I think like it helped that all the founders from day one kind of started being very open about, well, these things are like, let's try to play to our strengths. Like these things we're good at. And then it's easier for a team to kind of organize themselves around, well, if you put all of these together, what's a thing we could tackle? And because we didn't have any external pressure in the sense that there was nobody kind of dictating that we have to make this specific game. We didn't have to, it wasn't like a work for hire situation where we'd have to talk to a company and say that, oh, you have this IP. Yes, we all definitely know the IP. Meanwhile, furiously Googling yes, we're really good at doing those kind of games. Yes. We don't have any of that pressure. We can figure out what we can do. And that's why when we started the company, we made like a lot of prototypes and looked at like, well, these actiony things are really coming together in a hurry. And like, they're the ones that we enjoy making and playing the most, and then we picked like the one that was kind of the cream of the crop at the time and that we all believed in it the most, and we were able to in 3 months put it out there so there was already starting to generate not meaningful revenue but indicative revenue of like where we'll be going, and what eventually then became Mr. Autofire. That was a thing like of us playing to our strengths, and that's something we really want to replicate, and is what we're doing right now. We have a lot of prototyping going on, and I'm kind of, because I'm not telling people what games to make. That would be pointless. I'm not better at figuring out than the people who are actually making them. So what I'm kind of mostly going around right now is kind of reminding that, figure out what the strengths are. And then there's people in the company who have like ideas, who have really good ideas of what works in the market right now. And they're sharing, their takes on these are the things that we probably commercially would do well to look at. But they're by no means kind of exclusive that we have to do these. But again, that's the power of the advice process. Like if a team figures out, like, what if we want to make, I'm just going to put out a little stupid example, physical jigsaw puzzle game. Like, why would we do it? But the advice process then you kind of go through everybody who knows more about that. And they're pretty quickly going to give you a good idea of why jigsaw puzzles aren't going to be the thing. But this relies on... so this doesn't happen on its own, though. This relies on kind of people knowing who to talk to about various things, and kind of we know who know about which parts of technology and so on. If we were a larger organization, of course, we'd have to do more process work to get like this visibility. Like these are the people you should be listening to, maybe on things like this. But there are ways to do that. I'm not going to go into that. That's a little bit too much detail maybe for this. But there are these things like we kind of organize ourselves around these kind of swarms around topics, whether they're about like HR or hiring or technology or product, or even like summer party. Like these 3 people are doing the summer party this year. Like they can be either temporary or more permanent, but the idea is that people can kind of drift in and out of them, and those kind of form around a collective topic. I want to get to the question though you asked about salary. I think that's interesting because that we resolve that in the same way. We have what is called a salary advice group, which is some quite senior people, not in their sort of necessarily, they're not necessarily like the founders. Like I think two of us are represented there, and then employees who like being in a lot of organizations and have kind of this, how should I put, like this kind of social standing and a lot of sort of trust within the organization and perspective on these salaries. And they kind of dig information on things of, look at things, whatever inflation or whatever, how salaries are trending, whatever reports we can get our hands on and so on. And then when the time comes, people do themselves like make suggestions that, hey, I should probably be getting this. Can I get like advice on this? We do this annually. So the people say, hey, I'd like this change. And then people in the salary advice group comment on it. And then the person makes the decision. And of course, part of this is I contextualize that with the kind of financials of the company. This is kind of what we can afford right now. Like last time we should be keeping it within this level to be safe right now. And very transparent, like here are our financials. This is the money in bank. This is what, Mr. Autofart is generating for us. This is how many people are working on things that are not yet generating any revenue and so on. And that kind of allows then for people to, and then of course talk about the general things like inflation is high, so we need to factor that in and so on. And then people end up making good choices typically. Now, it's a thing like, and salaries are transparent. People have put their salaries up on our wiki that this is what I make, so others can go and look, and then it's transparent. The legally it needs to be done that way so that people can do it. And if they don't want to do it there, they shouldn't, but people mostly want to be open about that stuff. And I think it's in people's best interests that it's open and transparent. So, because I've seen so many people with so much resentment. I was there for 3 years and I was making half. You know that? Why do that? Why even go there? Yeah. It's you're shooting yourself in the foot. As an organization, they're going to be so bitter about it, realizing afterwards. And it's a really garbage tactical move for the finances of the company as well. But this way it's kind of transparent. It takes the realism of the finances into account. And again, if somebody says, I want to make 1 million a month, obviously we have the conflict resolution process because that makes no sense. But true to the fact also, we've got the salary advice group. They don't give feedback as the salary advice group. They give feedback as the 4, or I can't remember, it's 5 individuals now who each give their own feedback. It's 4 or 5 data points that you get at one go, and then you can look at, and then you'll have more data points, more information, and of course everybody's always free to talk to me. But that's another whole topic about like how perception of we always do a lot of work when somebody comes into an organization like this. You always have these inbuilt kind of reflexes, I'd say, that can we do this? And everybody looks at the highest ranking person in the room, and I try to make myself kind of, I feel I'm sometimes being like so obtuse, like by not answering these or throwing the questions back at people, but you have to like kind of do it because it's like kind of second nature to always ask for permission for things. And if somebody's like, can I run this campaign? Well, can you? Yeah, can I give you any, what kind of data would you like from me is more the sort of how I try to do that. And it takes when somebody comes into an organization like this, it takes a little while. And I've noticed like funny trends there. It can take, like, some people land on their feet very quickly, and some people take a longer time. It can take half a year for somebody to adjust to being like really part of the decision-making process. And I still have no way of knowing in advance. I always try to kind of guess whether somebody will be a fast or a slower sort of adapter into this, and it kind of goes wrong. It's 50-50, so I don't like it. It can go wrong very often. It can be surprising. And also the other thing is, and a completely unrelated thing is also, how active do they end up being in the decision-making process? That has little to do with how long it took for them to be. Some people are making powerful decisions on their first month, some making powerful decisions on their 6th month, and so on. And then some people kind of end up being on the kind of more on the sidelines of the decision-making process and maybe more focusing on their niche and only decisions regarding that. And I think that's good. I think it's good to have that kind of diversity. I think what you do want to have is a critical mass of people who want to engage in that. And maybe I've talked to a lot of founders who are thinking like, should we start something, our company doing like with that kind of a mindset? And then they ask, what should we take into account? I think like one of the things like you really want to think about is also the seniority of the people. You don't want to do this if you haven't kind of seen a few organizations and their ups and downsides. It's that context is important for you. Like, I think that allows for you to build the process as you need it, like as it becomes important for you to have it, and not front load that, but rather rely on your collective experience to avoid the most sort of the biggest potential pitfalls and not ruin the company by not having all the process in place. But I think there's that. And then the flip side of that is you do eventually want to have people who are less senior, but who see what you're doing as a great opportunity for them, that they want to be part of it. And those people are then going to help you challenge a lot of the old sort of jaded and more sort of, I think if you have a very senior team, you can easily fall victim to old constraints that are not there any longer. And I think that's a big trap. That this is not necessarily a teal thing, but I think a teal organization is vulnerable to that too.
Mm-hmm. A lot to absorb, because I think like here, as you're talking really a whole company structure that is very again uncommon period, but as well in games there's so many elements of it that I try to summarize as well based on what you shared. I think although there's no process, there's a certain structure, and it's kind of different definition, right? Which I take away the advising process structure, advising.
Well, the advice process, I call it. I think that's what everything kind of generates from that.
Yeah. Advising, the conflict resolution, who you're hiring, and also some prerequisites that you mentioned as well, reflecting on some points, a certain level of seniority because of what worked, what didn't work in their own organization, and how can we remove all the noise. Because one thing I can reflect as well, like I have seen also different organization, a bit size, corporate as well, and the limitation of those roles, especially I think a good point you mentioned, when you have different people already with the background of a company, they come with their own definition and so on, and it's a lot of waste actually here. And the metaphor I see about what you've tried to achieve with your studio is basically helping people getting as close as possible to who they want to be in a working environment, because it's like you remove your title, you remove your not your experience but your expectations and assumptions from
and
where
your
you
facade. I feel you remove the sort of like you build like a mask around, like no, I'm perfect underneath. You remove a lot of things,
and you expose yourself in a way with what you're good at. So you have to think and feel confident enough to say what I think I'm capable of and where I can help, and also because everyone else is doing it, also admitting very honestly to yourself and others what you're not so good at. But because you're removing kind of expectation of a title, it's a bit easier. That doesn't mean it's easy to also talk openly about maybe I'm a great producer for XYZ reason, or like a tradition, but I'm not like excellent producer in standard of industry, and I don't have to attach to myself like I'm not so good at that, and maybe I don't want to do that. So I find it really interesting where self-organize, like in a self-organic way, like the skills, the people, the interests are complementing each other and find the group, even like what you call about the swarm group, like the groups of advising that naturally form based on interest or knowledge.
Yeah, swarms.
That's also another form of structure that is very organic, based on where are we today and who do we want to be. So for me, like it's very inspiring because it's transformative as well. Like we started the conversation as the co-founders, you all had to break your ego and deconstruct it. Like, who are you if you're not your title? And you're doing kind of the same work for whoever is joining you, is to redefine who they are and maybe being closer to who they are. Because creativity comes as well from the self, what you believe in and growing. And it's, for me, I always look for and value when places where having mature professionals. And this is a process that either you manage to mature through the process because it takes a lot of self-development, or it's not for you and it's too uncomfortable and you get ejected by the system. It's usually that's how it is. But am I correct, like reading this that way? Because
it's true. Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. And I think people, like, we've had cases of people kind of finding out about themselves as they join, and I think like the whole no titles thing also helps us in that, like a very convenient way to structure yourself as an organization, like speaking as a former producer, is to have producers who look after the team kind of and have a very sort of unicorny job description of knowing a little bit about everything, and reality, like realistically being competent in half the things you should be. Like that's a very common role to have. So that's one of the things that we found. Like we don't have a no producers rule. That wouldn't be us. But rather we're like, let's be a little more specific about what the work is. And what's happened is that we, like for Mr. Autofire, like there's certain aspects of what a producer would do that is being done by the product manager, evolving into some of those things. There is, again, there are no roles, but a person who previously used to be a product manager, and then the person doing a lot of QA work actually stepping up to the plate and doing a lot of the producer functions of a team, and it allows for multiple people to approach and take a role that is typically like one of those roles where it's hard to be really good at all aspects of it. And I think that's where the trust comes into play as well, because you have to, that involves people going, I feel I'm on a journey to get there and I think I can do it. I'd love to give it a go. Are you supporting me, in that? And then giving it a go. And then there's been situations where people try to go somewhere, oh, this isn't working, but they can come back and or evolve somewhere different. And I think that's really healthy. I think that's, for us, because the teal organization has like a reason for existing. We haven't kind of put it into words yet, and we hesitate to put too much into words before we feel it's actually true and battlefield tested. But I do think that one of the things we're doing has to do with sustainability, and specifically sustainability in the sense of like, how do we make a place where a person can build a full-blown meaningful career in games and doesn't like have to, that isn't constantly kind of buffeted by the organization's structural changes, but where people can actually evolve meaningfully. That's kind of where we want to be. But of course, we're still a small company. Let's see if we get there. But I think that will be a worthy goal. That, like, I feel so much of what we do is still very project based as an industry, and then has all the sort of negative underpinnings of like technology work and project based entertainment stuff. And I think there's a lot of potential in teal thinking there. And we just want to be we feel it's meaningful to be at the forefront of finding things out. There's so much to learn still, but yeah.
I'll be back in 5 years and we have that conversation to follow up, but I'm completely behind. And I think here, what you create with a workplace, I come from the lens of people as well, like looking really, from what I understood, like people really come here to figure out who they are, like what they're, and even like socially, how to navigate this very uncomfortable conversation, but in a trusted environment, it's not that uncomfortable. And I think this is the most meaningful way from my experience of being as a professional and as a person. And I'm very grateful that people like you are, in the forefront to believe in and creating that place that you've been dreaming of being part of, right? So this is the only way to experience it, is to create it yourself as well.
It is, and I'm personally happy that I found like the right group of co-founders who all kind of want to do this thing, prioritize this to be an important thing in their lives for years and years, and then that we lucked out and find like the employees that started joining us. A lot of them were old colleagues of ours initially, and I think that's where the force comes from, that a lot of people believing that this is a meaningful thing to do. Like they've accomplished, they've made like hit games and experienced like being in famous organizations and so on, and that's great. It's all good, but I think I'm just happy that so many people wanted to join for the ride and are in that. I feel it's good to explore.
Exactly, for the long journey. And I have a last question to close our conversation, and so many things to reflect. I'm so grateful for all the things you shared, and looking forward to future conversation. Maybe one reflection for you is there something like through all that experience that you feel regret of, or like a mistake, like a misbelief, like something you thought would be working and hasn't worked, and that you would like to share as well as my last question?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's been a lot of sort of learnings on what doesn't work when you do something like this. I think like I kind of assumed that we would be able to that hiring would be kind of very convenient as it used to be, like just get people in. I didn't realize how slowly and deliberately you have to grow the organization, and how much of Like my effort and a lot of the founders' effort has to be not just, and I don't mean the act of hiring and signing papers. I mean the whole process of putting ourselves out there, advertising as an employer, and then going through interview processes, onboarding people, finding out if they're doing well, and so on, and sort of explaining the company to them. Like I assumed that's going to be a breeze going in, that, well, surely that's not even a thing, but that turned out to be like a really big thing. And a lot of the constraints that I didn't know exist for a company like this only became visible as we started doing this. One of the learnings is that it would be very difficult for us to operate with an outside publisher who has a lot of say in how we do things. Like we want to, that's why like we do the development and publishing everything in one team. Like a game team with us handles everything from the idea of the game to eventually, building and live operating and sunsetting it. But operating with other companies would be like fundamentally very difficult for us. And what really surprised me also was that once I got excited about this, I thought everybody would get excited about it. Sometimes you have that fallacy, well, surely everybody's super happy. And then I love that we had some people very early on say, that sounds terrifying, I want no part in it. And I'm so happy that we found the straight shooters, because most people just back away slowly and don't say anything. But they're like, no, that sounds catastrophic. I just want to come in the morning, check my Jira tickets, solve issues, get back home, forget about it. Like, that's all I want to do. I don't even want to talk to, I don't want to interface with the company at large. I realized that this is also like a specific dream for specific people, and that's okay, that's cool. But I thought it was like, no, surely there's a perfect organization. No, there's no single organization or organizational model is perfect. This is great for some people and terrifying for others. I think that was like, I just assumed that everybody would just kind of weirdly, I didn't tell myself this, but it was just an assumption that, well, people will mostly slot into this. And it takes a lot of time to find the people who are really into kind of, who see really like this as something meaningful for them, not just a thing they're willing to tolerate. So
yeah, and that's how you find your people. It's a slow process, but
it is.
Sustainability, when you are building a company for a journey long term, that's what it takes.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, thanks a lot, Kalle, for sharing all the steps, and I hope it's very inspiring for people, and if in some way they can reach out to you, Helsinki, especially in the community, to try some parts of it. But I'll summarize here the points, like really having first the vision of, again, the culture, why you have explained as well, like still formulating it as you are in the journey. Why do you care so much? But I think as professional, after having seen multiple things maybe that don't make sense for us, you really try to have an organization lean in a way that offer the best place for potential and creativity to express in individuals. And then that has also a cost, or like efforts in hiring, also that advisory process, conflict resolution, and with as a backup, that veto, if that has ever to be used, because it may, I don't know, risk the company, but that you didn't have to use so far with 30 people and 4 years in. So 5 years in, we'll talk again and let's see where you are. Yeah. Thanks a lot for inviting me over today and sharing all those learnings.
Yeah, so happy to have you here. Thanks for having me.